So, Kristi Burke is an ex-evangelical Christian who began deconstructing her faith at 19. I love her YouTube videos because they are personal and they discuss not just her personal journey while discussing, her insight and offering solidarity and encouragement. But I also appreciate that she's been making more videos about Christian nationalism and authoritarianism. There are very few YouTubers whose videos I really want to watch as soon as they come out. And Kristi is one of them. And I wanted to talk to her about her own history, her YouTube experience, and frankly, being a woman in this space that has been dominated by men for a really long time, especially in the non-theistic world. So I'm super excited that she could join me. Hi, Kristi. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How about you?
I'm fantastic. So, for people who are not familiar with you, first of all, tell us your YouTube channel, and then I would love to know how you even got into doing YouTube and how you began talking about any of this stuff.
Well, my YouTube channel is Jezebel Vibes. I actually recently underwent a name change to the channel. It was just my full name, but I have been Jezebel Vibes pretty much since I was doing TikTok before I ever got on YouTube. And the reason I started on TikTok was because I had been wanting to make content, kind of about my journey and in the deconstruction scene. It's when the deconstruction scene really kind of blew up. And I remember I was scrolling through Facebook and I saw somebody post. Some repost about how it's okay to be an atheist. It's okay if you don't believe in God, but you don't need to be telling people about it, and you don't need to be putting down other people's religion. And it was just this whole post about how atheists can be atheists, but they must be quiet about it, and it was disrespectful to be vocal about it. And I didn't like that. It just like kind of struck a nerve. And so I got on TikTok. I'd been primarily lurking, and I made my first video, and it was about that. And it was about how I felt like religious ideologies are often protected, but they are beliefs, and like any belief, I think that they should be carefully and critically examined and scrutinized, so that they are not you're not holding beliefs that aren't true, especially beliefs that can cause harm. And that is what prompted me. That was my first video. And it got a lot more views than I anticipated for having never posted on TikTok before. And from there, I just kept making content. It was mainly just deconstruction content for a couple years until I moved over to YouTube and started making fuller length videos.
So, where were you in your personal journey when you start thinking, I want to talk about this on TikTok? I don't want to be silent about this. Why should I keep my mouth shut about this? Like, were you at the point where you're like, yeah, I'm absolutely an atheist, or are you still questioning things? And I'm not sure I know exactly how deep your religious background was at the time.
Well, at the time, I was very much deconstructed, very much an atheist, and very confident in it. That was in 2021. And I had been out of the church since I was 19. I started really questioning things when I was about 17, but I was very deep in my religious indoctrination. I was born and raised in the Southern Baptist Church, and I wanted to live my life for Jesus. I went on mission trips and would go hand out tracts at the mall and try to witness to people in public. So I was very deep in it. And when I was 17, I just kind of went through a transformation in my own personal journey. Basically, I got to the point where I didn't really know what I believed about God, who God was, his characteristics. I had, kind of one version of Christianity that was the Calvinistic view, where it's like God predestines everyone, chooses who goes to hell and who doesn't, and there's really not much you can do about it. And then there's the other version that I was getting that was like God loves you and he wants a relationship with everyone, and each individual is special. And so I just struggled with that a lot, and I went through a couple years of trying to figure out what I believed until I was probably about, I don't know, 2021, and I realized I don't think I believe any of this anymore.
So a lot of that, I mean, that is not different from my own journey, but I'm
Mhm.
curious because I'm old. When I did it, I went through it very internally. There were not a lot of resources for me at the time, but what you're describing sounds a lot like the sort of person who would go into, well, what happens if I don't believe in God? let me read apologetics, counter apologetic books, and there are more of those today. But
Mhm.
I'm kind of curious if how much politics weighed into any of this, or if it wasn't, because I know for me, it wasn't a political thing. It was just something I've
Mm-mm.
kind of figured out on my own. But I wonder that if it happened today, how much of it would be tied into what's happening more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are kind of waking up in their churches, seeing what's happening and seeing what their fellow church members are supporting in the political sphere. For me, there were no politics involved at all, and in fact, I maintained some of my more conservative politics for a little while, even after I left the church, because I just went through kind of a period of being very confused, and all I really knew is that I had no idea who God was, and I wasn't getting any answers when I asked. So I lost my faith in God, but I was kind of in this limbo. I was kind of searching for something to believe in. I thought I had to find God. It was like a requirement of existence. And so I kind of went through like some new age beliefs and just some kind of light spirituality before I just kind of resolved myself to being an atheist. But it was probably a good year or two after I realized I was an atheist that I started really shifting my politics and like my views on abortion. That was a really big one. I was pro life for even a couple of years
Let's
after
talk about
I
that one for a
changed my
second.
mind. Yeah.
I want to spend time on that. Tell
Yeah.
me, I actually totally get how you could go from questioning God to becoming an atheist, even when you're coming from like a Southern Baptist background. Tell me how you go from being super anti-abortion to not, because that seems much harder for me.
Yeah, no, that was very difficult because a lot of people think that when you leave the church, it's like you change everything about your belief system. Everything changes, and for me, it wasn't like I was seeking out a new worldview. It happened to me, by accident, really, and really because I was seeking out what was true and not finding it. When it came to the abortion issue, I used to be very anti-abortion in my religious years. uh, I'm pretty embarrassed about it actually, but I'm very open about it. I used to walk around in a shirt that literally said abortion is murder, which kind of like, oh, it gives me a little kind of sickening feeling in my stomach now. But I just believed, what many conservative Christians believe, that that's a life and you're murdering it. And I didn't have all of the information about what women go through, why women get abortions, when most women are getting abortions and the life stages and all of that. And so it took some time, but I think what really it came down to me was autonomy. I just realized that bodily autonomy was a really important thing, and that probably just tied into my deconstruction of freedom and like wanting personal freedom and the freedom to think and the freedom to be. And I just got to a point where I realized that a woman, all people should have bodily autonomy. And if only women don't have bodily autonomy, then I think that there is an issue going on. There's some sort of a discrepancy. And it
Even
took
in
a
the
while, but
even among Southern Baptists, really, so much of that theology is built on forget abortion. It's women don't have control over their own selves, and the men control that.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, growing up as a woman in the church, you don't really feel like your body is your own, your mind is your own, your future is your own. It's all kind of in the hands of either God or your future husband, and that's kind of it. So yeah, breaking free from that is definitely really difficult.
How long did that process take you? Was it all at once, or I mean, I assume it's gradual at some point, but are we talking the span of a couple of years then altogether, where you go from
Definitely.
confident in God to confident in being an atheist?
Yeah, I'd say when I was 16, I thought I knew it all. I thought I was like, I've got the Bible, I've got all of my courses and my Bible study tools, and I know God and I know the Bible and I have a relationship with Him. And then when I was 17, that's when I was introduced to Calvinism for the first time ever. Even though I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, I think there wasn't a lot that they touched on within the whole predestination thing.
Can you
And
explain that? What's the
yeah,
difference between the two worldviews there?
so basically, Calvinism is the idea. I mean, it's kind of a whole theology, but boiled down, it's that God created everything with foreknowledge. He creates every person. with determination of who that person will become and where that person will go. And that it is not up to the individual to ask for forgiveness and to be saved, but it is up to God to call them to that. And if you're not called, well, you're not going to be saved. And I was not raised that way. I was raised to believe that Jesus loves everyone, that every single person is called to be saved, and that God wants to, save us all. And that's the point of mission work. And that's why I did mission work, because in my mind, there are all these people all over the world that are going to hell and they could die tomorrow and end up there. And I wanted to save them. I wanted to help as many people escape that fate as possible. And so when I learned about this idea of predestination, I was introduced to a passage in Romans where it talks about the potter and the clay, and how, how who are you to question God? He is your maker. He determines all, and it very much is a strong case for predetermination. And then I got to a point where I was like, well, if I believe that God is all powerful, God knows everything before it happens, and everything goes according to His will anyway, then it only makes sense that God is going to create someone knowing that they will or will not end up in hell, and that He will create people specifically to go to hell. And that really just kind of shifted my entire perspective of God, because to me, He was a loving Father who just wanted nothing more than to share a relationship with me and all people. But that wasn't compatible with a God who intentionally creates people, who punishes them in the most severe way possible just for not believing in Him, not getting the right information, not following the right religion. And so I couldn't justify that. And I could no longer look at God as the sweet, loving Father God. I had to really shift my idea of who God was. And that was the breaking point of my faith, because my entire faith was wrapped up in my relationship with this deity that I thought that I knew, and then I was realizing I didn't know it all.
You logicked yourself out of a John MacArthur entire sermon series
I
right there.
loved John MacArthur. I had all his study books.
At what point do you go? I mean, I've watched a bunch of your YouTube videos since you started doing it, and you spent a lot of time talking about, yes, problems with the Bible. Here's why I don't believe this stuff makes sense. And more recently, you've kind of shifted. I don't know if it's consciously or not, but you spend more time talking about the implications of Christianity, Christian nationalism, and how that's problematic. I'm wondering what made you. I'm not saying, oh, you're never going to talk about that old stuff again, but I know personally, I don't make that sort of content much either, because I feel like the implications are more important to me than proving to people why God doesn't exist or anything like that. I don't know if that's what your mentality is these days, or you just found this new passion for talking about something that feels more local, feels more personal, something like that.
Well, I think I always knew when I started creating content, especially when I switched over to YouTube, I always knew that I had this kind of underlying goal of helping a lot of people break free from this very oppressive ideology, because the more people who hold this oppressive ideology, the worse our society will get, and the easier it is for these ideologies to, work their way into our government and to be used. For as tools of oppression, and so I always knew that that was my goal, and that's what I wanted to accomplish, was to help people escape this, especially people who were just scared or confused, and they needed that extra push or encouragement to walk away. But I never got political, because I knew that I wanted to reach as many people as possible, and that I could possibly alienate people if I shared a political opinion. And so I just kept it very neutral, because I also knew that a lot of people I was reaching were people still in very conservative communities and churches. So I didn't want to alienate those people, but I always held very true to, my beliefs. And I feel like I always made it clear that most of my content revolved around this kind of conservative evangelical version of Christianity. And I would talk about it, being in our government, things like that. But when the election happened, I felt like a darkness kind of setting in, like a lot of us did, and I knew that, things were going to get a lot worse. And I started becoming very fearful of the future. And I just knew that I had a platform and I had a voice that a lot of people listen to, not just ex Christians and atheists, but Christians too. And I just felt like I had to talk about what's happening because to me it was just a more pressing matter. And so yeah, I mean, it was hard for me because I thought, okay, well, I'm probably gonna piss off a lot of people. I don't know how my audience will take it. Apparently, a lot of my audience assumed I was not like on the left or I didn't have progressive views. I'm not really sure why they thought that. So it did upset some people, but overall the response was very positive, and I just felt like it was just the right thing to do. It just felt like I needed to shift and pivot and talk about these issues that I feel like I've always been leading up to, and now they're here. So we need to really, really talk about them.
This may be a little tangential, but I wonder if you've had this thought too. Maybe 20 years ago, when those new atheist books were coming out, whatever criticisms I may have of some of those authors and stuff, they had to take a very superficial level. Here's why God doesn't exist. Here's why religion is untrue. And you can't get too in depth about it because the book can only be so long. And so it was opening itself to criticism because they can't speak to all people. They're taking a very
Mhm.
cursory look at Christianity almost entirely, and that concept of God, the most popular version of it, whatever. What I have come to really appreciate about TikTok, especially, but YouTube and all the other platforms, podcasts as well, is I have seen more people talking about their personal experience, how it plays out, what they went through, their deconstruction journey. And maybe a whole bunch of those people, I have no clue what they're talking about. To hear a Jehovah's Witness, former Jehovah's Witness, talk about what they went through, or someone who was a preacher's kid, or, name your minority religion and what they went through to get here. And it's like, you know what? I don't know what you're talking about. But the amazing thing is, I know people who watch that, who understand the lingo and who know what you've been through because they've been through it too, and you're going to connect with that person way more than you would someone like Richard Dawkins or any of the new atheist authors. And I feel like what you're describing too is, let me just talk about my journey, and who knows what will happen. And what you have found is that people are drawn to it because a lot
Mhm.
of people can relate to what you've been through in a way that feels personal and is honest. And it's just not something some of the more famous atheists that people have come to know, broadly speaking, can talk about because, I don't know, they've been atheists most of their life. They don't know what it's like these days. They did not grow up in purity culture. They haven't dealt with that stuff. And so that actually connects way more than a lot of the more famous atheists. And I don't know
Mhm.
if you have noticed that, if people have talked to you about that in comment threads, in messages you've gotten.
Well, I think there's a very big difference. The shift I see, and you can tell me what you think, is
Yeah.
that when I was deconstructing 15 years ago or whenever it was, yeah, it was like Richard Dawkins. There was a lot of those, there was the atheist experience and all of that. And I feel like a lot of that was very much rooted in like intellectualism. It's like this is an intellectual argument. We're using our brain and our logic here. So we got to use these logical arguments to tell you why this is wrong. And the new way seems to be a lot more rooted in our emotions and how we feel and our stories and our experiences. And I think that for a long time for me, I was very wrapped up in the intellectual, atheism. But then I realized at some point that the two, we need a balance between the two. We can't just be all intellectual. Here's why God doesn't exist. We can't just solely rely on our emotions because that's how people get trapped into religion. So I think finding that balance between logic, reason, rationality, but also something that's really been big for me on my channel is not telling people, hey, this is why this is wrong. This is why you shouldn't believe in this. It's more so, hey, this is what you're being taught. This is what they're saying. But does it make sense? Does it feel right? Does it sit right with your intuition and your sensibilities? And I think finding ways to bring those two together, getting people to think critically, but also checking in with themselves and saying, hey, does this even feel right? I think that's a really important part of deconstruction, questioning critical thinking that was missing before, is not giving people room to think about stories and feelings and emotions.
Yeah, it's very much gone from academia, which again has its place. I'm all for
Yeah,
those debates and stuff. But I mean, if there's one thing pastors know how to do really well, it's that they are not spending week after week making intellectual arguments for why
exactly.
God exists. They're telling you the emotional stories.
Yep,
And
pulling
it
the
is,
heartstrings.
yeah, and it works. And they're
Yeah.
really good at it. Some of them are very, very
Mhm.
good at that. And this is a reason I really appreciate when people are saying, look, this is what I went through. This is why I didn't enjoy spending time getting grilled about my personal life, which happens in some certain instances. Or here's how I was judged. Here's how I was restricted. It's like, yeah, that
Mhm.
is not rock solid proof of why the religion is wrong. But you're right. It doesn't pass the smell test of like, does it fit with your worldview these days? Does it make sense in any sort of meaningful way, even if it may not fit
Mhm.
some logic puzzle or anything like that?
Yeah, well, religion and spirituality, it's funny because Christians kind of participate in this too. I've noticed, like apologists, when we kind of go back and forth, they want me to provide an intellectual, logical reason that I am not a Christian. And if I can't do that, well, I'm wrong. But then they also are the same ones who claim Christianity is a personal relationship with Jesus, and when you're saved, you just know it and you just feel and hear his voice. And so,
And if you don't
it's
have that, well, guess what? That whole thing falls
exactly.
apart.
Exactly, exactly. So I think it's just finding the balance. And the more you learn about the psychology of belief, why people believe what they believe. I read a great book by David McCraney, I think his name is, How Minds Change. And it's all about that, psychology of belief. Also, The Righteous Mind by, I can't remember who wrote it.
Jonathan Haidt.
That's a
Yeah.
great book, and so learning about the psychology and how people actually tend to believe things way more with their emotions than with their brains. Like, we use our emotions to get the belief and to cling to it, but then we use our logic to, like, make ourselves feel more confident about it. So it
And it's
really
one
kind of
thing I really don't like about some of those new atheist authors, where when it's all logic all the time, they have very little empathy for how people actually process any of that stuff.
Exactly, exactly, and I think it makes you more open,
Mhm.
to, instead of being like, "Oh, you are a religious mindset, you're wrong," and just kind of closing it off. It's like, "Oh, well, we're all in our own unique path, and some people just believe it. It gives them hope and peace. Maybe we can just kind of work through together to figure out what's most logical, what makes the most amount of sense." It's a
Yeah.
much gentler
Not
approach.
everyone wants a lecture all the time.
Exactly, exactly.